Along the broad Hudson River, where the water often carries a cold, leaden hue and early morning fog can swallow the horizon whole, there lies a small island that was once regarded as little more than a barren outcrop of rock, detached from the accelerating rhythm of New York at the dawn of the 20th century. For decades, Polypel Island was little more than a feint on nautical charts, a place passing sailors rarely bothered to remember by name. But like many spaces that appear insignificant in American history, the island was eventually drawn into a role far greater than its physical size ever suggested. Not a symbol of art or leisure, but a symbol of fear, of war, and of an industrial ambition that recognized no clear boundary of safety. The early 20th century found the United States standing between two worlds. On one side was an era of progress, of steel and railroads, of massive corporations and powerful families growing wealthy through war and industrial expansion. On the other was a time haunted by instability, by the still fresh memory of the Civil War, and by the growing fear that the great powers of Europe were rushing toward conflicts of unprecedented scale, conflicts that America would sooner or later be pulled into. In this climate, weapons were no longer merely tools of war. They became strategic commodities, symbols of national strength, and for certain individuals, extraordinary business opportunities. Francis Bannerman VI was one of the defining figures of that era. Born into a Scottish immigrant family, Bannerman was neither a general nor a politician. He was a businessman, though not in the conventional sense. The empire he built was not based on civilian consumption or mass production, but on what remained after wars had ended. Firearms, ammunition, explosives, military uniforms, bayonets, artillery. Objects created to kill, once a conflict was over, became vast surplus stockpiles that the government urgently needed to dispose of. Where others saw scrap, Bannerman saw gold. By the late 19th century, Bannerman's sons had become one of the largest dealers in surplus military equipment in the United States. They purchased stockpiles from the federal government at low cost and resold them to foreign governments, paramilitary forces, and even civilian markets. Bannerman's catalog resembled a miniature museum of warfare, where every conflict left behind its trace in steel and explosive powder. Yet alongside this rapid expansion emerged a problem Bannerman could no longer ignore. New York, with its growing population density, was no longer a safe place to store thousands of tons of ammunition. Explosions at ammunition depots, though rare, were known to be catastrophic when they occurred. Major cities understood this well. Pressure from New York authorities steadily increased, forcing private arms warehouses to move away from populated areas. For Bannerman, this was not merely a legal challenge. It was a question of survival for his entire business empire. And it was within this context that Polypel Island appeared as a perfect solution. An isolated island in the middle of the Hudson River, close enough for transport by boat, yet far enough away, in Bannerman's mind, to keep any potential danger safely removed from the city. In the year 1900, Bannerman purchased the entire island. Not to build a factory and not to live on it. His intention from the beginning was unmistakable. This would be an arsenal. Not an ordinary storage site, but a repository for ammunition, explosives, and heavy weaponry on a scale unmatched by any private enterprise within New York State. Yet to legitimize the project, Bannerman did not choose transparency. Instead, he cloaked it in symbolism. A castle. The architecture of Bannerman Castle, with its watchtowers, thick stone walls, and medieval European fortress style, was not the product of purely artistic ambition. It was a language meant to communicate protection, control, and safety. Bannerman carved the name of his company directly into the stone, a declaration of ownership and authority. But behind those walls were no ballrooms or grand halls. There were thousands of crates of ammunition, tons of explosives stacked within a space where a single mistake could have turned the entire island into a colossal bomb. What is striking is that at the time, very few people outside Bannerman himself and his closest associates truly understood the scale of what was being stored on Polypel Island. There was no transparency, no modern safety standards. What existed instead was a vague belief that the Hudson River was wide enough to absorb any potential disaster, and that physical distance could substitute for responsible risk management. It was a belief that perfectly reflected the spirit of the age, an age that trusted technology and human ambition to outrun every limitation. From the riverbank, Bannerman Castle appeared almost romantic, a strange and picturesque structure rising from the natural landscape. But for those who understood what lay inside, the scene carried a very different meaning. It was a reminder that only a short stretch of water separated the peaceful towns of the Hudson Valley from a concentration of destructive force capable of altering local history in an instant. For many years, that reality remained hidden, or at least deliberately overlooked, until a series of incidents began to reveal the true cost of prolonged silence. This part of the story is not about a disaster that happened. It is about something more unsettling. A disaster that could have happened at almost any moment, and nearly did on more than one occasion. To understand why the United States allowed a private explosive arsenal to exist in the middle of the Hudson River for decades, we must look more closely at Francis Bannerman himself, at the network of power, profit and indifference that surrounded the island like a dense fog. And it is there that the story truly begins to grow uneasy. To understand why Polypel Island was able to hold such an immense quantity of ammunition for so many years with so little sustained opposition, it is necessary to return to the man behind the decision. Francis Bannerman VI was not reckless, nor was he blind to danger. He was a product of an expanding industrial America, a society in which successful businessmen were often viewed as forces of order and efficiency in the uncertain aftermath of war. In the eyes of his contemporaries, Bannerman was not trading in death. He was trading in stability, as that era chose to define it. Born in the year 1851, Bannerman came of age in the shadow of the Civil War, at a time when the United States was flooded with surplus weapons, but lacked a coherent system for safely disposing of them. After every major conflict, the federal government sought to liquidate its military stockpiles to reduce costs, and men like Bannerman emerged as a convenient solution. He built his reputation on speed, on his ability to purchase large quantities quickly, move them efficiently, and resell what the state no longer wished to store. In purely economic terms, the process made sense. But when repeated for decades and scaled to thousands of tons of ammunition, it created a dangerous gray zone between public interest and collective risk. Bannerman understood the power of imagery and language. His company catalogs, some running hundreds of pages, were more than inventories. They told stories of past wars, transforming weapons into historical artifacts, objects stripped of their immediate threat. In this framing, the storage of massive quantities of arms appeared less like a hazard and more like preservation and distribution. When Bannerman constructed a castle on Polypel Island, he extended this logic into physical space. If weapons could be reframed as memory, then the place that housed them could be reframed as heritage. Behind that narrative, however, lay a far harsher reality. Explosives are indifferent to symbolism. Ammunition does not age safely simply because time passes. Many explosive materials manufactured in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were far less stable than modern equivalents. They degraded over time, becoming increasingly sensitive to heat and moisture, particularly when stored for long periods without rigorous inspection. These facts were well understood in military circles. But once such materials passed into private hands, the boundaries of responsibility became dangerously blurred. For years, Bannerman's freight vessels made regular trips to Polypel Island. From the riverbanks, local residents could see large wooden crates being unloaded, but few were ever told what they contained. Local authorities, lacking clear jurisdiction over federally sourced private military stockpiles, often chose silence over confrontation. Bannerman was a man of connections and reputation, and more importantly, he represented employment and revenue. In a growing economy, questions of safety were frequently subordinated to the promise of prosperity. What made the situation even more troubling was the absence of comprehensive risk management within Bannerman's own operations. Storage facilities on the island were densely packed, designed to maximize capacity rather than separation. The idea that a single ignition could trigger a cascading chain reaction was not seriously addressed. The prevailing belief was that the Hudson River itself served as a natural buffer. If something went wrong, the damage would remain contained. It was an assumption grounded more in comfort than in science. Francis Bannerman died in the year 1918, just as the First World War was coming to an end and global demand for weapons began to shift. His death did not end the operation of the arsenal on Polypel Island. Instead, it left behind a complicated inheritance. The Bannerman family continued to manage the business in a world that was slowly tightening safety standards, while the consequences of earlier decisions remained firmly in place. The castle on the island became more than a storage site. It became a historical burden, a structure built for a past era yet persisting into an increasingly uneasy present. The prolonged silence surrounding Polypel Island did not exist because no one sensed the danger. It existed because the danger was diffused, pushed beyond everyday sight, and covered by a social tolerance for risk that defined the period. Only when minor incidents began to occur, subtle signs that could no longer be ignored, did serious questions start to emerge. What would happen if an arsenal designed by 19th century logic were forced to confront the realities of a changing 20th century? This is where the story begins to shift. Not through a single catastrophic explosion, but through the slow accumulation of warning signs that would eventually force the surrounding communities to confront what they had long chosen not to see. For many years after the death of Francis Bannerman, Polypel Island existed in a suspended state between two worlds. To the people living along the Hudson, the island and its grey stone castle gradually became part of the familiar landscape, something almost harmless through repetition alone. To the Bannerman family, it was an inherited asset, carrying both economic value and the symbolic weight of an empire built over a lifetime. But for the arsenal itself, time did not pass neutrally. It began to expose weaknesses that no layer of stone or carefully crafted narrative could conceal forever. The early decades of the 20th century marked a period of uneasy transition in the history of industrial safety in the United States. Lessons drawn from catastrophic ammunition depot explosions in both Europe and America were starting to gain wider recognition, yet the application of new safety standards moved slowly, especially for facilities that had existed long before such standards were codified. Polypel Island sat precisely within this gap. It had been created for an era that asked few questions, but it continued to exist in a time increasingly defined by concern. The earliest warning signs did not arrive in the form of a major disaster. They appeared quietly, scattered, and therefore easy to dismiss. Workers on the island began to notice irregularities. Some ammunition crates showed signs of decay, their wooden frames rotting, their metal components corroded by the unstable humidity of a river environment. Explosives, originally designed for short-term use, had remained in storage for years, in some cases for decades. Each movement of these materials, each act of loading or unloading, carried a risk that could escalate beyond control with a single mistake. Within the surrounding Hudson Valley communities, rumors began to circulate. Few people knew exactly how much ammunition remained on the island, but most understood that the quantity was far from trivial. From time to time, strange sounds were reported coming from the island, the clatter of metal, occasional plumes of smoke whose origins were unclear. No major explosion followed, and it was precisely this absence of catastrophe that reinforced complacency. When the worst does not happen, people are inclined to believe it never will. Local authorities began receiving occasional inquiries from riverside residents, but official responses were generally reassuring rather than investigative. On paper, Polypel Island was private property. The activities of Bannerman's sons occupied a grey area between commerce and military supply, dividing responsibility across multiple levels of government. No agency was eager to be the first to sound an alarm, particularly in the absence of undeniable evidence of immediate danger. This hesitation was not born of malice. It was the result of a system accustomed to inertia. At the same time, the castle itself began to reveal its limitations. Built rapidly with storage as its primary purpose, Bannerman Castle was never engineered to endure decades of harsh weather and gradual structural fatigue. Rainwater seeped through stone walls, drainage systems proved inadequate, and high humidity crept into interior spaces. Each winter, cycles of freezing and thawing weakened the structure further. These forces threatened not only the architecture, but the stability of the munitions stored within it. What made the situation increasingly alarming was the transformation of the world beyond the island. Traffic along the Hudson River intensified. Riverside's towns expanded, populations grew, and what had once seemed remote no longer truly was. An incident on Polypel Island, if it occurred, would no longer be contained by geography alone. It would ripple outward into communities that had never consented to bear such risk. Yet for many years, the connection between the arsenal and public safety remained inadequately acknowledged. Physical separation fostered the illusion of moral distance. The first cracks in the silence were not marked by an explosion, but by the accumulation of unease, a growing sense that something was wrong, even if no one could yet articulate precisely what it was. Local newspapers occasionally mentioned Bannerman Castle as an oddity, a relic of post-war arms commerce, but rarely examined the question of danger in depth. At this stage, history was still being written through avoidance. This chapter reveals how disasters are often incubated, not through a single reckless act, but through countless small decisions, delays, and assumptions left untested. Polypel Island remains still on the surface of the Hudson, while within it the conditions for a serious incident quietly converged. And when those conditions finally aligned, the decades of silence would no longer be enough to hold the balance. The transition from vague anxiety to tangible fear rarely happens in a single moment. On Polypel Island, it unfolded as a process, one in which long-ignored warning signs gradually connected into a pattern that could no longer be dismissed. The middle decades of the 20th century marked the most fragile period in the history of the Bannerman Arsenal, not only because large quantities of ammunition still remained, but because the world around it had changed in ways the island was never designed to withstand. After the Second World War, the concept of industrial safety in the United States began to shift decisively. New standards emerged, oversight agencies gained authority, and society grew less tolerant of invisible risks. Against this backdrop, Polypel Island became an uncomfortable anomaly. It was a relic of an earlier era, yet it continued to house highly destructive materials under conditions that no longer aligned with modern expectations. The gap between regulation on paper and reality on the island widened with each passing year. The first incidents serious enough to draw sustained attention did not take the form of a massive explosion. Instead, they appeared as localized accidents. Certain auxiliary storage buildings exhibited unusual heat buildup, believed to be the result of slow chemical reactions within deteriorating explosive materials. Workers were forced to relocate ammunition under conditions that lacked adequate protective equipment. Each intervention was a gamble. Success passed without comment. Failure, had it occurred, would have allowed no opportunity for correction. Information about these incidents spread beyond official channels. Stories circulated through riverside towns, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes downplayed, but always carrying a growing sense of unease. For the first time, the surrounding communities began to question not just the presence of the arsenal, but the justification for its continued existence. Polypel Island was no longer merely private property. It had become a shared risk, imposed on thousands of people who had never been consulted in the original decision. State and federal authorities could no longer ignore these concerns entirely. Inspections were proposed, though not always fully carried out. Overlapping jurisdictions continued to slow meaningful response. Responsibility remained unclear. Did it belong to New York State, the federal government, or the Bannerman family? While legal questions were debated, time continued its work, degrading both the structure and the materials stored inside. A critical turning point came when a relatively small explosion, powerful enough to be heard from the riverbanks, shattered decades of complacency. Although the damage was limited and no lives were lost, the incident destroyed the illusion that the situation remained under control. For residents along the Hudson, danger became audible. The sound of the blast traveled not only through the air, but through collective awareness. It transformed abstract concern into an urgent question. What would happen if the next explosion were not small? The response that followed exposed the limits of risk management at the time. Reports were written and recommendations issued, yet concrete action remained slow. Removing or safely neutralizing a vast quantity of aging ammunition required resources, technology, and coordination that no single party was prepared to fully assume. In this vacuum, Polypel Island continued to exist as a suspended threat, acknowledged yet unresolved. Bannerman Castle, originally constructed to convey permanence and control, now carried a very different meaning. Its thick stone walls no longer symbolized safety, but stubbornness. A structure preserved beyond the lifespan of its original purpose. The island's isolation, once considered its greatest asset, became a liability. Every intervention was more complex, more dangerous, and more delayed because of its position in the middle of the river. This chapter marks the moment when Polypel Island could no longer be treated as a problem for another day. It forced the community, the authorities, and the Bannerman family to confront the long shadow cast by decisions made generations earlier. Yet as history so often shows, recognizing danger does not guarantee swift resolution. What followed would reveal the true cost of delay, and how a forgotten explosive arsenal came perilously close to rewriting the history of the Hudson Valley. If, for decades, Polypel Island had existed as a latent danger that was never fully acknowledged, the summer of 1969 brought that ambiguity to an end. What had long been treated as a manageable risk could no longer be explained away through reassurance or delay. The Bannerman Arsenal finally revealed its true nature in a moment of violence that could not be ignored. The explosion that year did not erase the island from the map, but it shattered an illusion that had endured for nearly 70 years. The belief that danger could be indefinitely contained through inaction was no longer tenable. The blast was not a total catastrophe, yet it was powerful enough to tear through a significant portion of Bannerman Castle. Sections of the facade collapsed, stone and debris fell into the Hudson River, and a visible wound was carved into a structure built to project strength and permanence. The force of the explosion cracked walls, destroyed roofs on several auxiliary buildings, and most critically, exposed what many had refused to confront. Ammunition and explosive materials still remained inside. They were not inert. They were not harmless. The precise cause of the explosion was never conclusively determined, but subsequent investigations pointed to the gradual deterioration of aging explosive materials stored under unstable conditions. Summer heat, accumulated moisture, and the decay of wooden containers combined to create an environment ripe for uncontrolled chemical reactions. This was not an unpredictable accident in the truest sense. It was the foreseeable outcome of decades of postponement, of trusting luck where science and oversight were required. The reaction along the Hudson Valley was immediate. For the first time, fear was no longer abstract. Residents could hear the blast, see the damage, and imagine what might have happened had the explosion been larger or had it triggered a chain reaction throughout the remaining stockpiles. Questions once quietly set aside now became urgent demands. Who was responsible? Who would ensure this never happened again? And why did it take an actual explosion for meaningful attention to follow? New York State authorities and related agencies were forced to respond with a level of seriousness previously absent. Polypel Island was officially designated a hazardous site, and access was sharply restricted. Emergency safety assessments began, focused on questions that were no longer theoretical: how much ammunition remained, in what condition, and whether the island could continue to exist without posing an unacceptable threat to surrounding communities. By this point, the Bannerman family no longer possessed the financial or technical capacity to address the consequences of an arsenal built for a different century. The business empire once associated with the Bannerman name had already declined, and the explosion of 1969 transformed its legacy from a moral burden into a legal ill and public safety liability. Polypel Island ceased to represent entrepreneurial ingenuity and became a case study in the dangers of privatizing control over weapons and explosives. The lasting impact of the explosion extended far beyond the physical damage. It permanently altered how Bannerman Castle was perceived. Once seen as a romantic curiosity, it became a visible warning. Every crack in its walls, every missing section of stone, testified to the cost of prolonged complacency. The explosion of 1969 was not merely an accident. It was a historical reckoning that forced hidden realities into the open. When the dust finally settled, a new and more difficult question emerged. What was to be done with Polypel Island and the dangerous materials that still remained? Demolition, cleanup, and preservation each carried serious risks and ethical complications. There was no solution without consequence. From that moment forward, Bannerman Castle entered a new phase of its history. One defined not by commerce or concealment, but by reckoning. After the explosion of 1969, Polypel Island could no longer exist in obscurity. What had once been tolerated as a distant and abstract risk became an undeniable public concern. Closing the island to all unauthorized access was the first unavoidable step. Warning signs were erected, river traffic was instructed to keep its distance, and Bannerman Castle entered a period of complete isolation. No longer an active private property, it was reclassified as a hazardous site requiring constant oversight. Safety, rather than history or architecture, became the immediate priority. Surveys were launched to determine how much ammunition and explosive material still remained on the island. The process was slow and dangerous. Each crate approached carried the possibility of triggering a reaction that could not be contained. Cleanup crews worked under severe limitations, with technology far less advanced than what would later become standard, and with the constant awareness that a single mistake could have catastrophic consequences. The effort to reduce the danger extended over many years. Not all explosive materials could be removed immediately. Some had to be neutralized in place, others transported away in carefully controlled stages to avoid concentrating risk. Throughout this period, Bannerman Castle existed in a state of suspension. It was no longer an arsenal, yet it could not be considered safe. Every intervention required a delicate balance between mitigating immediate danger and avoiding further structural collapse of an already weakened building. It was during this phase that a profound debate began to take shape. One side argued that Bannerman Castle, given its history of danger, should be demolished entirely. From this perspective, no architectural or historical value could justify preserving a structure that had once threatened the safety of an entire region. Demolition, they claimed, was the only way to permanently close a dangerous chapter and ensure that no future risk remained. Opposing voices called for preservation. To them, Bannerman Castle was more than a failed storage site. It was a rare physical record of a moment in American history when private industry, warfare, and public safety collided without clear boundaries. Erasing the structure would also erase an opportunity to confront the lessons embedded in its walls. According to this view, the very danger the castle once represented was precisely what made it worth remembering, as a warning rather than a monument. New York State found itself caught between these positions, facing pressure from local residents, historians, and preservation advocates alike. Each option carried heavy costs, both financial and political. Demolition required immense resources and still involved significant risk. Preservation demanded a long-term commitment to stabilization, monitoring, and restricted access, all while the structure remained fragile and difficult to reach in the middle of the river. As the debate continued, time itself became an active force. Without continuous maintenance, nature slowly reclaimed the island. Vegetation pushed through cracked walls, moss-covered stone, and each winter's freeze and thaw cycle weakened the structure further. With every passing year, the range of viable choices narrowed. Bannerman Castle increasingly became a symbol of indecision, shaped not by a single definitive choice, but by delay, compromise, and erosion. This chapter reveals that the consequences of the Bannerman Arsenal did not end when the explosion subsided. They persisted in the difficult decisions that followed. Volatile Island became a place where history was no longer a closed chapter, but an ongoing challenge. A challenge that asked how society should confront the dangerous legacies it inherits, and whether remembering them honestly might be as important as eliminating the risks they once posed. N letter 1 E B F U B letter 1 E A N M U letter 1 E D 1 N Min S letter 1 E B D. As debates over demolition and preservation dragged on without resolution, Bannerman Castle entered a different kind of existence. It was no longer an active arsenal, yet it had not fully become a protected historical site. Instead, it occupied a void within collective memory, a place where history remained physically present, but lacked an agreed-upon narrative to guide public understanding. It was within this void that the meaning of Bannerman Castle began to shift. For generations who came of age after the explosion of 1969, the castle was no longer directly associated with explosives or imminent danger. It appeared instead as a strange ruin in the middle of the Hudson River, at once romantic and unsettling. Crumbling walls, empty towers, and vegetation overtaking stone turned Bannerman Castle into an object of imagination rather than precise historical knowledge. That ambiguity became both an opportunity and a risk. Historians and local preservation groups began to recognize that if Bannerman Castle's story was not told responsibly, it would be reinterpreted in ways that obscured its most important lesson. An explosive arsenal that had nearly caused catastrophe could not be remembered merely as a scenic backdrop for photography or adventure tourism. Reframing the site was therefore not only about saving architecture, but about preserving memory and transforming the ruin into a cautionary narrative about the cost of trading public safety for convenience and profit. A significant turning point came when New York State formally assumed ownership of Volatile Island and Bannerman Castle, bringing it under public stewardship. This decision did not immediately make the site safe or easily accessible, but it established a new framework, one focused not only on risk reduction, but on transparent historical interpretation. Bannerman Castle began to be treated as a living case study, a physical reminder of the long-term consequences of industrial decisions made without sufficient oversight. Selective stabilization and conservation efforts followed, aimed not at restoring the castle to its original appearance, but at preventing further collapse. Each stone preserved served a narrative purpose rather than an aesthetic one. When limited public access was allowed, it came with strict regulations and contextual explanation. Visitors were not invited to admire a fairy tale castle, but to confront a place that once housed immense destructive potential. This shift reflected a more mature relationship between society and its hazardous heritage. Within broader academic and policy discussions, Bannerman Castle increasingly appeared as a reference point in debates over industrial and military legacy sites. It raised a persistent question. What should be done with structures that possess historical value while also embodying past danger? Should they be erased to eliminate risk, or preserved to educate future generations? As Volatile Island demonstrated, the answer rarely lies at either extreme. It requires balance, and more importantly, a willingness to acknowledge past mistakes rather than conceal them. The symbolic power of Bannerman Castle thus extended beyond its physical boundaries. It became a statement about how societies choose to remember. Transforming a near-catastrophic arsenal into a carefully interpreted historical site was not an act of glorifying danger, but an attempt to learn from it. Each broken wall and empty storage chamber silently asked the same question of those who stood before it. What would we do differently if faced with similar risks today? This chapter completes an important arc in the story. Bannerman Castle, once the result of a single private business decision, became a public lesson. From a concealed explosive depot, it evolved into a visible warning about the cost of delay, secrecy, and misplaced trust. Yet the story was not finished. Because the greatest value of Bannerman Castle lies not in what happened there, but in how it continues to shape our understanding of responsibility, memory, and risk in the modern world. As Bannerman Castle gradually found its place within local history, another truth became increasingly clear. The story of Polypel Island was not unique. It belonged to a broader pattern repeated across nations and generations, wherever weapons and hazardous materials were stockpiled, concealed, or quietly forgotten after wars had ended. Seen from this perspective, Bannerman Castle became more than a regional curiosity. It became a lens through which to examine how modern societies confront the dangerous legacies they create for themselves. Throughout the 20th century, the world accumulated vast reserves of surplus weapons in the aftermath of major conflicts. From Europe after the First and Second World Wars to rapidly industrializing regions in North America and Asia, the same question appeared again and again in different forms. What should be done with instruments of war once peace returns? In many cases, the initial answer mirrored the logic that had guided Francis Bannerman: store them, disperse them, delay decisive action, trust that time itself would solve the problem. History, however, has repeatedly shown that time is rarely an ally when it comes to dangerous materials. Explosions at munitions depots, environmental contamination from explosives and military chemicals, and fatal accidents during disposal efforts all stem from the same underlying mindset. Bannerman Castle did not produce an international-scale catastrophe, but it reflected the very mechanism that has led to far larger disasters elsewhere. A decision made under pressure, maintained for economic convenience, and prolonged by overlapping authority and the reluctance to confront real costs. The danger was not created overnight. It was allowed to mature. What makes Polypel Island particularly instructive is its proximity to everyday life. It was not hidden in a desert or confined to a remote military zone. It sat in the middle of a river central to commerce, history, and community life for thousands of people. That closeness amplifies the warning embedded in its story. It reveals how fragile the boundary truly is between what is considered isolated and what directly affects the public. A stockpile may sit behind fences and warning signs, but its consequences, if unleashed, rarely respect those limits. In later academic and policy discussions, Bannerman Castle came to represent the necessity of transparency and long-term accountability. Private ownership of hazardous materials raised questions that early 20th century legal frameworks were ill-equipped to answer. Who bears responsibility when risk extends across generations? Can the profits of one era justify the danger inherited by the next? These questions, posed belatedly along the Hudson River, remain unresolved in many parts of the world today. The story of Bannerman Castle also underscores the power of collective memory. When a danger does not erupt into a full-scale catastrophe, it tends to be minimized or forgotten. There are no national memorials for disasters that almost happened. No official days of remembrance for the lives that were never lost. Yet it is precisely these near disasters that often carry the most valuable lessons. They demonstrate that avoiding the worst outcome does not mean the original choices were sound. Sometimes it simply means that luck held a little longer. In a globalized and industrialized world, where risk now extends beyond weapons to include chemical waste, industrial byproducts, and sensitive technologies, the relevance of Bannerman Castle is striking. It reminds us that every decision to store, delay, or defer action transfers risk forward in time. Polypel Island, with its crumbling walls rising from the Hudson, gives physical form to an abstract truth. Dangerous legacies do not disappear. They wait. This chapter expands the story of Bannerman Castle beyond geography, placing it within a global historical context. Not to equate scales of disaster, but to recognize recurring patterns. These patterns suggest that the issue lies not with one family or one island, but with how societies manage the aftermath of their own progress. In that recognition, Bannerman Castle ceases to be merely a local ruin. It becomes a quiet, persistent warning to the modern world. As the physical danger on Polypel Island gradually came under control and Bannerman Castle entered its life as a managed historical site, a different kind of conflict emerged. It was no longer about explosives or collapsing stone, but about memory itself. How should this story be told? Should Bannerman Castle be remembered as a symbol of American entrepreneurial spirit, or as evidence of failure in risk management? As a fortunate near miss, or as a warning ignored for far too long? Within academic and historical circles, Bannerman Castle occupies an uneasy position. Some scholars emphasize the historical context in which Francis Bannerman operated. They argue that the storage and resale of surplus weapons after war was a common and even encouraged practice at a time when the state lacked the capacity to safely dismantle or destroy such materials. From this perspective, Polypel Island becomes a product of an incomplete system rather than an act of individual irresponsibility. Bannerman, in this reading, represents an error more than a moral failing. Others strongly disagree. They point out that even by early 20th century standards, the long-term storage of massive quantities of ammunition under opaque and loosely regulated conditions carried obvious dangers. The fact that Polypel Island did not erupt into a large-scale catastrophe, they argue, should not be mistaken for validation of the original decision. It was not proof of safety, but proof of prolonged luck. History judged solely by outcomes risks excusing hazards that remained real for decades. This debate intensifies when Bannerman Castle is presented to the public. Every interpretive sign, every guided tour, reflects a choice about which story to emphasize. Highlighting the castle's unusual architecture and the Bannerman family narrative can attract interest, but it also risks romanticizing the site. Focusing exclusively on danger and near disaster, on the other hand, may strip away the broader economic and social forces that shaped the decision in the first place. Striking a balance between these interpretations has become one of the central challenges of managing the site. Bannerman Castle thus serves as a case study in the ethics of remembrance. Not all historical landmarks commemorate triumph or achievement. Some exist primarily to remind us of misjudgment, of decisions made under pressure that carried consequences long after their immediate benefits had faded. The question is not simply whether such places should be preserved, but how honestly their stories should be told. How much complexity can be presented without reducing the past to either celebration or condemnation? In academic conferences and scholarly publications, Bannerman Castle is often compared with other industrial and military heritage sites around the world where similar tensions exist. These comparisons reveal a broader shift in historical thinking. Modern societies are increasingly willing to confront dangerous legacies rather than erase them. But that willingness only has value if the narrative includes both intention and consequence, both context and cost. This scholarly debate clarifies a central truth. There is no single correct way to remember Bannerman Castle. It exists at the intersection of multiple histories of business, warfare, public safety, and collective memory. Which aspects are emphasized reflects the values of the present as much as the realities of the past. In that sense, Bannerman Castle is not merely an artifact of history. It is a mirror, showing how each generation chooses to interpret complexity, responsibility, and risk. As the story of Bannerman Castle draws to a close, what lingers is not a defining catastrophe, nor a number etched into national memory. What remains is something far more elusive and unsettling. A sense of unease rooted in what might have happened. Polypel Island did not enter American history as the site of a great tragedy, but as a place that reminds us how often history is shaped by luck rather than wisdom. Bannerman Castle forces us to confront a form of responsibility that is rarely acknowledged. Responsibility for risks that never fully materialized. For nearly 70 years, the explosive arsenal on the island existed because of a chain of assumptions. The assumption that distance alone could protect surrounding communities. The assumption that dangerous materials would remain stable if left undisturbed. The assumption that the absence of disaster meant the danger had been exaggerated. These assumptions were not overturned by policy or foresight, but only challenged when part of the castle collapsed in the year 1969. And even then, the worst outcome still did not occur. For this reason, Bannerman Castle raises an uncomfortable question about how history should be remembered. How do we record a danger whose most devastating consequences never came to pass? There are no memorials for near disasters. No anniversaries for lives that were never lost. Yet this absence does not make the story less important. It makes it harder to face. It demands that we evaluate the past not by its final outcome, but by the process and decisions that carried risk forward for decades. In the modern world, where hazards are increasingly complex and systemic, the lesson of Polypel Island feels strikingly relevant. Not every danger announces itself through immediate catastrophe. Many exist quietly, sustained by routine, delay, and the belief that responsibility can be deferred. Bannerman Castle shows the cost of that thinking. Even when no lives are lost, the price is paid in prolonged uncertainty and in the burden passed on to future generations. Preserving Bannerman Castle as a carefully interpreted site is not an act of closing the past. It is an effort to keep the past speaking. The ruined walls no longer contain explosives, but they contain questions. Questions about the limits of economic ambition. Questions about the obligations of private ownership when public safety is at stake. And questions about how societies should confront the dangerous legacies they inherit. These questions resist simple answers, and that resistance is precisely what gives the site its meaning. To stand before Polypel Island today is to see more than a ruin in the Hudson River. It is to see the physical trace of human decision-making, where each individual choice once appeared reasonable, yet over time accumulated into a risk that no one fully controlled. Bannerman Castle reminds us that history is not only shaped by obvious mistakes, but by choices that seemed acceptable within their moment. This conclusion does not seek to judge Francis Bannerman, or those who followed him by the moral standards of the present. Instead, it invites reflection on systems, on how short-term benefits can obscure long-term danger, and on how collective silence can sustain risk longer than any single decision ever could. In its deepest sense, Bannerman Castle is a lesson about the importance of asking difficult questions early, long before disaster forces them upon us. When the story finally ends, what echoes is not the sound of an explosion, but the silence that followed. A silence filled with the recognition that history might have taken a different path, with only a small change in circumstance. Bannerman Castle stands as a reminder, carved in stone and surrounded by water, that responsibility does not begin when disaster strikes. It begins the moment danger is recognized and nothing is done. And in those moments of inaction, history is written, not by what happened, but by what almost did.